we're asking ourselves, why do we believe the things we believe? The reason we're examining that theme is because throughout Scripture we find the admonition that we need to be ready to give an answer for our faith. Especially, Moses will comment that we need to be able to tell our children why we do the things that we do. So it's important for us to understand why we engage in the things that we engage in. We've been looking at some of the boundaries that God has established for us and trying to comprehend what that means and what we need to be teaching because of those boundaries. We've been concentrating over the last few weeks on some of God's instruction regarding gender responsibilities, and largely because our world has so confused that issue that it's becoming more and more obscure what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And so it's important for us to look at what God has to say about those topics. We have been using Titus chapter 2 as our text. We have thus far covered God's assignments for mature men, where he lets us know that older men are to be self-controlled. That means a mental control as well as behavior. They're to be respectable, sensible, sound in faith, sound in love, sound in endurance, finding God's peace in every situation. And we talked about each of those and what they mean. We talked about God's assignment for more mature women. And again, we found that this particular text says that they should be saturated with truthfulness, that there should be nothing devilish at all in their conversation, in their attitudes. We talked about the fact that their spiritual service is free from physical distractions. We talked about the fact that they are to be mentoring young women in the practice and the practical ways of serving the Lord and serving God. So those were the responsibilities of older women that we looked at last time. Today we move on in that text, and if you are familiar at all with that text, you know we're going to be moving into a discussion of younger women. However, before we get there, I feel compelled to lay a little bit of groundwork and a little bit of foundation before we examine what we're going to look at. You know, for decades there has been an attempt to restructure what masculinity is. And some of that may be propagated in the fact that there maybe was a time in our society where males were almost dictatorial with their authority, and so there may have been some backlash in trying to say that's not how it's supposed to be, and rightfully so. And so there may have been a swing to redefine what masculinity is. Thus, I think we have a culture right now that has not become content with just redefining it, but our culture right now wants to emasculate masculinity, making all things masculine malicious. But our culture no longer wants to just say, okay, here's what it means to be male. It wants to say, being a male means you're bad. And so masculinity, to a large degree, is being portrayed with maliciousness. At the same time, equal efforts have been engaged in by our culture when it comes to the role of women. So we have this, let's bring men down, but transversely, let's bring women higher. And so what has happened is that motherhood, home building, etc., all of those have been abandoned for the purpose of self-promotion. And our young women get tempted and tried with this cultural teaching very often. Betty Friedan was one of the primary founders of the feminist movement. You may be interested to know the motivation for beginning that. She went to her 15th year college reunion and did a little informal survey of some of her former classmates. What she found out is that most of the women there were not satisfied with their life. And so she reached a conclusion from just asking that question, and that was, she concluded that the only way that a woman could find fulfillment was to become equal with a man. In other words, in her assumption, had she asked the men at that reunion, if they were satisfied, they would say, oh, absolutely. But the women weren't. So the only solution that she thought was, you've got to elevate and make yourself equal with a man. She proclaimed that the sphere of female was this: the kitchen, church, and home. She thought the only way then to make yourself equal with men was that you need to have a serious career. That was the solution. And so she viewed the feminine gender as being weaker, but that weakness could be overcome. It could be overcome by gaining respectability and being equal with men, and the only way to accomplish that task was to put yourself in the workforce to make yourself equal at every level. And that's primarily what the feminist movement has as its objective. Interestingly, this whole movement began with what they decided to call a consciousness rising. We want to raise your consciousness of this problem. Now that sounds pretty benign and safe and unintrusive, but the reality is that whole philosophy is disastrous. Because in reality what it is, it's consciousness altering. It's not raising your consciousness. It's altering what you think. And that's the gist of what began decades ago in this feminist movement, was to alter the way women process. Nothing new. It's been around for a long time. Satan found it effective. One of the more recent examples is when Mao was in process of conquering through China in the 1930s. He used this process. He called it speaking bitterness. And what he did historically was that he held sessions within villages, and he would infiltrate with his spies and his backers. He will infiltrate these villages, and then they'd have a meeting. And he would work on sowing seeds of bitterness and anger. And by the way, primarily, he found the most useful subjects to be female. So he would come into a community, and he would conduct a speaking bitterness session with the objective of making people angry and bitter. What happened then, as people grew in this bitterness, such chaos ensued that his military could just walk in, and rather than being perceived as the enemy taking over, they were perceived as the remedy rather than an assault. Now that's the same technique that's being used today in our culture in the feminist movement. Speak bitterness. Get women to be angry and bitter about things that they didn't used to be angry and bitter about. Used to find fulfillment in some of those areas, but now, no, you're not supposed to find fulfillment. It's supposed to make you mad. It's supposed to make you bitter. And it's worked. It's worked very effectively. As a matter of fact, a Washington Post survey of just a couple of years ago says that 6 in 10 women call themselves strong feminists. 6 in 10. This movement has become so prevalent that those who take seriously their responsibility of home building, motherhood, and partnership have been relegated to feel inadequate or less than those who fight for the cause. One woman experiencing that struggle wrote these words: "Sometimes it seems like the religious right has the corner market on home living. They approve of my desire to homeschool and to try to make my marriage work out even in hard times. Meanwhile, in the secular world, I feel that I'm considered to lack career ambition, to be overly attached to my kids, and probably codependent with my husband." You see, our culture has been aggressively trying to get women to believe their role is something different than what it was created to be. These mind games to reshape male and female persona have blurred the reasons, the purposes, the objectives that God initially created within the specific genders. Now let me state this without any form of reservation. Those who choose a life elevating their responsibility as wives, mothers, and home builders should feel no less significant by making those choices. It is honorable, it is good, it is praiseworthy, it is fully in keeping with what God created you to be, to find fulfillment in those things. On one level, humanity exists in equality. There's no question about that. Scripture makes that very plain. However, it functions with diversity of assignment. And that doesn't make anybody less important or more important. Marcy Farrell has a website. She's actually written an ebook that you can get for free if you so desire, called Motherhood: Delighting in Our Children. Here's her comment: "Women will never find fulfillment and satisfaction by trying to be like men and shedding their uniqueness as a female. they will only find satisfaction in Christ. Our text. Older men are to be self-controlled, worthy of respect, sensible and sound in faith, love, and endurance. In the same way, older women are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not addicted to much wine. They are to teach what is good, so that they may encourage the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be sensible, pure, good homemakers, and submissive to their husbands, so that God's message will not be slandered. So today, we're going to look at God's assignment for younger women. The first responsibility that we find spoken of is not specifically stated in the text, but the context gives strong implication. The younger women have to be teachable. They have to maintain an attitude that is ready to be taught. If older women are to teach, to admonish, to train, to encourage, and to advise, then younger women must be teachable. There must be those willing to be taught if older women are to do the teaching. And so right away, this tells us something about the attribute in the heart of young women. Needs to not be that they are trying to have all the solutions, but that they are open to receiving instruction, to being taught. The Creator identifies that receiving instruction from others is not necessarily part of the natural course for any of us, not just young females. Proverbs chapter 9 says, don't rebuke a mocker or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. Instruct a wise man and he will be wiser still. Teach a righteous man and he will learn more. So younger women need to be wise. And that wisdom means I'm ready to receive instruction. Again, the fleshly nature may not go that way, but those who are righteous are going to make sure that they're teachable. It's wise to receive instruction, but an unteachable heart will twist loving training into pretext for hatred. Have you ever witnessed that? Someone tries to give some instruction to someone whose heart is not teachable, and that becomes the very essence that generates hatred and bitterness and anger towards the one who tried to give that instruction. So, first thing must be teachable. Secondly, teach them to love their husbands and their children. Teach them to love their husbands and their children. I want you to notice, first of all, the time in which this is written, in which paganism and various forms of God worship existed, this was radical teaching. Telling a woman to love her husband, to love her children, was so much different than the culture of that day. This was very unique. Husbands are given the instruction to love their wives. We listened to Ephesians this morning, and Colossians repeats that same thing. Husbands are to agape their wives so as to keep from growing bitter, that scripture says. The root word means to be sharp. So husbands are to agape their wives, put their well-being above your own, so that you don't get too sharp toward your wife. But you know, it's unique, the challenge that younger women are given here. It's not agape. They're to phileo. Younger women are to have a friendship love with their husband and with their children. A friendship love. By using phileo, Paul identifies that older women need to instruct younger wives to be their husband's best friend. God recognizes the nature of the male ego. And the reason I know that, did you listen carefully to Ephesians 5? Husbands, you're to love your own wife as what? As you love yourself. God knows, guys. We have that built in. We love ourselves. And so God says, husbands, you take that ego that you have that leads you to self-love, and you love your wives. God knows that. But you know what? A wife's love, this friendship love, this phileo love, is also based on the fragile male ego, because it's the supportive love. It's the friendship love. A wife and God, in recognizing the needs between husband and wife, a wife brings into that relationship the ability to support her husband by her love. Isn't it amazing how well God knows his creation? That's no easy task. And so the older women who have successfully accomplished that are given the responsibility to teach the younger wives the value and the virtues of supportive love. Having the same affection for children likewise presents distinct challenges. This is a challenge to move beyond the natural motherly instincts. This is a friendship love toward children. This is a love that moves a mother to focus lifestyle, a plan of action, to cultivate within her relationship with her children the spirit of godly character, affection, keeping God as the primary focus. This has to do not with knowing how to raise your kids perfectly according to Dr. Spock or whoever the latest writer is. This has to do with implementing the issues of spiritual conduct and character into the lives of your children. That's how you support them. Younger women are given that responsibility. Thirdly, younger women are to be self-controlled. We've watched this now through every stage we've looked at. Older men are to be self-controlled. Older women are to be self-controlled. Younger women are to be self-controlled. Guess what? Yeah, young guys fall in there too. This goes back to the instruction that's been given earlier to the older women, to the older men. Younger women are to learn self-control. Shared a few weeks ago how that this word, back when we were talking about older men, had the idea of mental clarity and sensibility. It has to do with discretionary efforts. It has to do with the idea of personal strength. Knowing when it's time to act swiftly and when it's time to, in patience, endure something. That's what self-control is. And younger women need to practice self-control. I'm going to just propose that if any of you have learned this, self-control on any level, it probably involved witnessing someone do that. Self-control isn't one of those things that we just typically, learn by experience, and obviously that contributes to it. But more probable is that we witnessed someone who was self-controlled in a certain situation, and we thought, wow, that person knows when not to act. Or, wow, that person knows when to act. Self-control. Hence, Paul's instruction in this lesson is that younger women need to witness this. It needs to become something that they see that is taught by the more mature women. Number 4, to be pure, to be clean, to be innocent, seeking cleanliness in thought and deed. It carries the idea of being undefiled, uncontaminated. Typically, when we think about purity as a male issue, we oftentimes reference things like Solomon in Proverbs chapter 6, where he introduces evil as this enticing female who is attempting to win over my son. When we think about purity with males, we primarily process a seduction of some kind. Sexual seduction or attitude seduction. While men may be naive about some of those seductive tactics, and that seems to be some of the reason that Solomon gives that warning, women may be more enticed by emotional seduction. I think that the admonition, or some of what's involved in this, is to be very careful about reading material and entertainment and friends and what we associate with and what we put in, because what we put in is what's going to come out. So I think this whole instruction for young women to remain pure is to watch what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're processing. The 5th responsibility of younger women is to be homemakers. Some translations say to be busy at home, others workers at home. The art of being a homemaker is quickly becoming a lost art in American culture. There's so many things that we used to know as a people that we don't know anymore. A younger woman is to have her home as her primary base of operation and thus the main focus of her attention. Now, remember earlier when I said women who choose to make home and partnership and children priority should not feel any less adequate? I'm not sure that those who make the choice to include an occupation in their lives need to feel guilty either. And the strongest evidence that I have of that is Proverbs chapter 31. Because if you read about this worthy woman, you will find that not only was she a homemaker, that her husband called her blessed, that her children lacked nothing. That's a pretty powerful statement. And that she stayed up into the wee hours sewing and spinning and doing all of these things for her family. But she also had some outside things. And she knew how to buy things and sell things. That sounds almost occupational, doesn't it? The only thing I will say is young women who choose to blend all of that, you've got a drastically difficult task to put that all together. Not impossible. Solomon lets us know that. Being a homemaker is not an institutionalized form of bondage and slavery. It is the context in which the female gender can experience the gratification and satisfaction as she is free to live the gender responsibilities for which God has created her. Now, there was a reason why Adam was not good by himself. There was a reason why that God caused a deep sleep and took a rib and created woman. There was a reason that when Eve was brought to Adam, he said, "Whoa, at last!" Because there was completion of humanity by what each brought together. And so it is that women need to view and understand that the gender responsibilities that God has given you are not less than those of men. They may be different, but they are equally significant and important to the wellness of family, of society, of the church, of community. Number 6, younger women are to be good. Some scholars find this a descriptive word of homemakers, and so they don't list it that way in translation. However, the word oftentimes, if it's listed separately, it's listed as to be good or to be kind, to do good. The primary meaning of kalos in the Greek is the beautiful, moral, good, or virtuous. But that's not the word that is used here. The word that Paul uses here is the word agathos, which means good in every sense. In other words, this is not an admonition to be morally good, to be attractively good, to be virtuously good. It is on every level. Your life is characterized by being good. Perhaps we can best understand this by just saying, you be like Jesus. The challenge is to be like Jesus. Then lastly, 7th responsibility to younger women is to be submissive to their husbands, or some translations say subject to their husbands. When we go back to what has happened in our culture, this has been turned into the ultimate nastiness. This is the ultimate downgrading of all females, is to be subject to a husband. Makes it sound as though you're inferior in some way. The idea of submission is that one yields their will to another. It is more an attitude controlling one's actions than actions themselves. Compounded from the Greek word hupo, which means under, and tasso, which means to arrange. When one is in submission, they arrange themselves under. Somebody else doesn't do that. You do that. You arrange yourself under. So, when we open the pages of the Bible, who submits? Who is it that is told to submit, to arrange themselves under? Well, obviously, the text that we just looked at, younger women are to submit to their husbands. But there's some other passages. Citizens are to submit to their government, Romans chapter 13. The church submits to Christ, Ephesians chapter 5. Followers are to submit to leaders, Hebrews chapter 12. Christians submit themselves to God, and He will exalt you. Slaves are to submit themselves to masters. If we bring that into modern terms, an employee submits himself to an employer. And Christians are to submit to each other. So the whole concept of arranging myself under is far more than something that takes place only in the lives of young women. Husbands do it to their wives. Christians do it to each other. We do it to our government. We do it to church leaders. We do it to God. Submission has nothing to do with inferiority or being less than somebody else. Here's how I know that. Therefore, I will give him the many as a portion, and he will receive the mighty as spoil, because he submitted himself to death and was counted among the rebels, yet he bore the sin of many and interceded for the rebels. Who's that talking about? Jesus. What did Jesus do? Submitted. What did he submit to? Death. Jesus put himself under death. Now let me ask you this next question. In what sense was Jesus inferior? Absolutely nothing about Jesus was inferior. He was 100% flesh. He was 100% God. He was sinless. He was a perfect Jew. Nothing about him's inferior. But he submitted. Submission has nothing to do with inferiority. The challenge for us to be people of submission is not a downgrade of any kind. It's the attitude of submission that creates tranquil peace within countries, one's spiritual relationship with God, within the church, as well as on the job, and within the home, as husbands and wives live within the mutual elevation of each other. So here's what we've looked at from this text. Younger women are first of all to be teachable. They're also to love their husbands and their children. They are to be self-controlled. They're to be pure. They are to be home builders. They are to be good or kind, be like Jesus, and they are to be submissive. Those are the instructions that are given for that time of life, for that gender. Ladies, how are you doing at fulfilling the roles that are assigned to your gender? As with older men and older women, great responsibilities are involved here, but there's also great opportunities that are contained, and there is great joy when we do and fulfill the obligations that God has established for our gender. That joy can be experienced when we fulfill the roles that God's created for us.